Hey class, it's Professor Yaden here. Everyone else is asleep here. We're all isolated. I don't have anywhere to go, so I thought I'd sit down and answer some of your questions from the discussion boards. There was some really great questions that I really liked and wanted to jump around to them. If I didn't answer your question here, it's still probably a good question, but I want to keep this video short. So I want to jump through some of these. Also just realized my daughter got a little slobber on my shirt. Apologize for not being more professional. Well, let's go through and answer some of these questions. Mariah asked, could I better explain about wisdom, woman wisdom, and life, and the echoes of pre-fall Eve, death, folly. So sort of this idea of how does woman wisdom and woman folly, how do they connect back with sort of former stories? The first one is with Eve, right? Eve is seen as both someone who gives life to Adam and someone who helps destroy. The word in Genesis that's used in 2:18, I think it is, that's used for Eve, that I think in the King James is translated helpmeet, some others are translated helper. That word sometimes is used to connotate, people think that women were made a little lower than men, but that's not what that text is saying at all. Actually, the Hebrew word there for women, when they say helper, that word, the only other person in all of Scripture that word is used for is God, right? So the way that women help men in that creation story is ultimately in a similar way that God helps them, right? It's not that they are inferior, they're below them, and they're just like their sidekick. They are at least on equal grounds, right? And so we see Eve helps Adam, gives him life. Then after the fall, right, Eve hurts Adam, destroys him in the same way that wisdom, right? In one part, Eve is personification of Lady Wisdom, right? She is the one who gives life. On the other side, she is a personification of woman folly. She takes away, she causes death. In Solomon's life, we see a similar thing where women in his early life actually bring him life and draw him closer to God. Later in his life, they pull him away. So you can see that kind of connection there to Solomon, right? Women bring life, women kill him. Okay? Let's see another question. Haley, great question. In the Proverbs, if women make men pay attention, then why weren't the women the ones teaching it instead of just being written about for men to read? That way both sides would be educated. That would have been great. I agree with you. But these ancient societies were still patriarchal, right? They still had some issues with women being equal to men, just to be honest about it. Now, what is cool is that ultimately, even though women are used here for men to talk about stuff for men, actually what happens later on in the tradition is that wisdom actually gets connected with God, especially in the Gospels. You'll see this in the Gospel. There's a little section in your textbook where wisdom, Lady Wisdom, actually gets connected with God, that actually almost becomes like almost one with God throughout the Scripture. So we see this sort of jump of the feminine that we don't see in a lot of other cultures, where this feminine aspects is actually connected with God. Even in the creation story, we have some feminine aspects given to God. And so that's a great question. Let's see what else we got here. Let's jump on to the Job Ecclesiastes, right? Question, how do you know this book is talking to other books? Does it specifically mention them by names, or do you just know by the context clues? Mostly by context clues, right? They use words, they use phrases that come from other places. Kind of like sometimes we might use a phrase that everybody knows from a movie, right? Somebody outside of that culture probably wouldn't know it, or outside of our culture wouldn't know that phrase. But we do, right? Because we've all saw that movie. When I was a teenager, it was all the Will Ferrell movies. Everybody knew all the things, and people would say stuff, we'd all laugh. If you hadn't seen the Will Ferrell movies, you would have no idea. But because you had, you connected. Same thing with the Bible. If you had read those books in the Hebrew, we'll say that in Hebrew, you would catch on to what they're saying, right? Going back and forth. So that's how it kind of connects back to other books pretty explicitly in ways. But you have to know the Hebrew sometimes to get that. I only know that because other scholars tell me. Let's see. Jake says, I don't understand the point in which the Bible states that Job is just, as you said, that God doesn't know this, even though he's said to be omniscient. Wouldn't he know that Job is just and innocent if he is all-knowing? Yes. Sorry, I might have misspoke there. God knows Job is just. His friends don't. His friends are arguing Job must have done something wrong. That's why God laid the hammer down on him, I guess, so to speak. Elizabeth says, if they're unaware of the author of Ecclesiastes, then on what grounds have they determined the validity of the writing, and that it should make an appearance within the rest of the major books. In the ancient world, they just didn't care as much about authorship, right? They just, it wasn't that important. The contents of the book were more important. So they looked at Ecclesiastes and they said, man, this has some good stuff in here. This has some important stuff for us to pass on. So they put it in there, passed it on. Okay. Yeah, it's more about the contents than the authorship. Authorship is later on. In these ancient, we don't know who wrote most of the ancient texts, right? Whether it's like the Hammurabi's Code or any of that stuff. We don't really know who wrote a lot of that stuff. They just don't seem to be interested in telling who they are. Do Ecclesiastes and Job have the same overall idea of goodness and wisdom? I think it's pretty similar, actually. It's this idea that there's a lot out of our control. So have trust in God and enjoy what you can, right? Keep doing what's right, even in the midst of a corrupt and broken world that doesn't make sense anymore. Let's go to historical background. Actually, no, we got Psalms first. Do we think the Psalms were written in different generations because of the different stories? What if they're all written at the same time? I think they were written in different generations, yeah, because I think they do tell stories from different times, right? We have Psalms that are clearly referencing David and what David is doing. So we would think that that probably at least originated around David's time. We have other Psalms that come later that reference Babylon, right? And sitting by the streams of Babylon. So it's a different generation. So that's why we think they come up at different times. Why they have different authors and why they come from different times and different stories. And my Psalms discussion is messed up right now. So we're going to stop. That's going to be the only question from the Psalms. I'm sorry. Let's jump to the historical backgrounds of the New Testament. If you have any questions here. It says that the Samaritans are descendants of Jewish people along with a mixture of other people. Does that mean that they were that hated? I think of this as kind of like people who are really far off from me, right? I don't have strong opinions towards, right? I just don't, right? But now if someone close to me really hurts me and they screw me over or do something, or they do something I don't like, they're going to make me really mad and I'm going to be really angry towards them. I'm going to really hate them. Versus, you know, if some random dude in New Mexico does something wrong, I'm apathetic towards, I don't know him. But if my brother does something to me, I'm going to be really mad. Or if my brother does something stupid, right, I'm going to be really mad at. Why? Because we're so closely connected. When you're more closely connected to people, you have stronger emotions. I think it's the same thing with the Jewish people and Samaritans. They were real closely connected, but just a little off, which led to really strong emotions before them. I've had a few questions about Sadducees and how one become that. You become a priest through lineage most of the time, through your family. Now, to become a Sadducee, it was more like a party as far as I know. It wasn't like, oh, you have to fill out a form to become a Sadducee. It was more, hey, I have this view, I'm going to join this political party, right? It's kind of like you don't have to really do anything to join the Republican or Democratic Party. You just have to have similar ideas. And so that's how you kind of join the Sadducees. What was the Pax Romana? Good question. That protected Romans. Why did this allow them to treat people they did? That's a great question. The Pax Romana was kind of, hey, we're going to keep the world peaceful from our point of view, right? You do what I say and the world's going to be peaceful, right? All these countries, you do what I say, you follow our rules, we're going to be peaceful. The problem is that they set all the rules, right? So if they didn't like the customs or a culture, they just made rules against them. And so they said, oh, and then when that culture went against that, they said, oh, you're breaking the peace. Sorry, guys, sucks for you. And so the Pax Romana was ultimately just about the Romans having their way with people. It looked peaceful, it looked good from the top, but ultimately at the end of the day, it was a way of them keeping in control and making sure everybody behaved the way they wanted to. Let's see. And Steve, great question about if Joseph and Mary were part of these groups. As far as I know, we don't have any proof of any of them. They seem to be very poor wherever they are. And generally in that time, if you're very poor, it's hard to have strong opinions. A lot of times you're just doing your work. I mean, you might have strong opinions, but it's hard to act them out and join a party, right? So they probably have their strong opinions. I'm not fully sure. But we don't know if they were joined a part of it because they were pretty poor and it's probably hard for them to get into them, from the best I know. Now, I'm not sure about that. I would need to maybe research that more, but I've never read anything about them being joined to any of the Sadducees, Pharisees, Zealots, anything like that. Let's do that. Let's go to theological backgrounds. I'm going to keep this well under 15 minutes. That was my goal. I had this question a lot. Why do we say Jesus is apocalyptic? It kind of makes him sound terrible, right? Also, why do we say another world was created? Makes it sound like there's more than one earth, and earth had the evil on it, and other had all the good on it. Those are really good questions. When we say Jesus is apocalyptic, we had a lot of questions about that. What I mean by that is that there is sort of these grand powers, right, of good and bad fighting each other. And when Jesus was on the scene, because the Jewish people had been under foreign control, they've been oppressed for so long, it felt like these evil powers were dominant, right? They were going to win. They had the final say. And so when I say apocalyptic, I mean that God steps in, right, in a very abrupt, a very sudden, in a very powerful way to make those powers fall apart, to kind of take them down. When I say there's another world that comes onto it, I mean as in like there is a new kind of world. It's not literally another world. I think that can be confusing. But there is another kind of world that comes into what place, right? I think a world that Jesus is trying to inaugurate where people act with love towards each other instead of justice, or love and justice instead of hatred and killing and murder, right? Jesus is wanting to say, hey, this world is possible. I've brought it to you. The kingdom of God is near. Now in the cross, and we had a few questions about that, I think what ultimately happens is that, and this is a little more theological than biblical, right? This is some later theological thought, that on the cross, the powers of evil throw everything they have at Jesus. Every single, right, bullet, mortar, whatever you're going to say, tank, all the powers of evil attack Jesus and come right on him. Everything comes on to him. They come with all their hate, with all their power, all the sadness they created, like all the powers of evil, right? So in the moment when Jesus dies, all the hate of the world, all the power, all the sadness, all the hurt, everything combines onto Jesus, right? And in that moment, instead of choosing hate, instead of attacking back, right? He says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He defeats hate with love in that moment, right? And then we also know that he defeats it again later in the resurrection, right? He even defeats death itself through his love, through the power of God. And so in that way, the powers of good come and they destroy the powers of evil, which is apocalyptic sort of talking, right? But they don't do it in the ways we think. We think of like violent bloodshed, all this stuff. Oh, we're going to cut their heads off. That's not the way it does. He defeats the evil powers in love, and in the process creates the possibility, this sort of ability to have this new sort of world, right? Even in Revelation, when it talks about Jesus coming back and defeating the powers of evil, he never strikes them, right? The sword comes out, but he never actually fights them. He defeats them with another power, right? A power that's greater than evil, than sort of violence and hatred. We had that one a lot. Apocalypse. I want to say this again. Apocalypse doesn't mean that Jesus says, hey, we're going to kill everything. We're going to destroy everything, right? It means, hey, the powers of evil, God has broken in a very abrupt, a very sudden, God has revealed himself and destroyed those powers. Now, it looked differently than what we thought it would, especially what the Jewish people thought it would, but he still did it, is what Christians believe. And you see Paul using this language a lot in Romans 6 and 8. Are these apocalyptic beings physical or spiritual? I think primarily they are spiritual, but they come out in physical ways, right? They are primarily spiritual, come out in physical ways, right? It's kind of like the animating forces behind evil. That they would say that in our country, right, like poverty or something like that, there's some sort of evil force that keeps poverty going, right? In those sorts of ways. I think are there any religions that just revolve around only the New Testament? Good question. There was a group of Christians called the Marcionites that came along a little bit after the New Testament was written, and they said the Old Testament was bad, evil, God wasn't right. We only follow the New Testament. Most Christians called them heretics and said, no, that's not right. The Old Testament actually fits in with the New Testament. What made Christianity distance itself from Judaism? Again, they had different beliefs, and they were fighting about what the future of belief in Yahweh would look like. Would it be the Christian way or Jewish? It's a great question, Brian. Good questions. I think I went over these. Great questions. I'm going to finish this before 15 minutes, but great questions. I appreciated them. I don't know if anybody watched this, but if you do, I hope you enjoyed it and got some questions answered. Thanks, guys. Bye.